Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm speaking to someone who used to run a company that grabbed a lot of my attention during my teenage and younger years. That company was Capital Radio, and listeners who grew up in and around London will be familiar with the brand. At the time I was growing up, it was by far London's biggest radio station. My guest, David Mansfield, was CEO of Capital and subsequently GCap Media until 2006. From there, he moved into various roles, maintaining a presence in the radio industry, but also working with other successful businesses like Carphone Warehouse and Game Group. He's an investor, business advisor and coach, a fellow of the Centre for Evidence-Based Management and the Radio Academy, and has been a visiting professor at the Bayes Business School in London and a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford. I didn't just invite David onto the show to reminisce about radio in the old days, fun as that would have been. I also wanted to hear about the Monday Revolution, the title of a book and the name of a mission that David has founded to simplify business behaviour and provide all executives, whatever their role or size of company, with tools and approaches to get more done. In our discussion, you'll hear what the revolution is and why it's called that. We explore David's highly practical tips to making business and the people within them more effective. We talk about things like risk management, how to empower staff, the benefits of asking the right questions in the right way, the importance of giving people agency, and critically, how to make better decisions. Now, if that sounds like a wide-ranging discussion, it is, but David has some fabulous stories and some wonderful insights to share. I'm absolutely convinced that if we follow many of the steps that he talks about, not only will workplaces be more fun and we'll all get more out of them, but will also help to mitigate human risk. So stand by for David Mansfield on the Monday Revolution. David, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Christian.
I'm so excited to have you here, and we are talking on a Monday, which is quite convenient because your book, The Monday Revolution, which I absolutely loved, hence we're here talking about it, is called that. And I want to get in, what do you mean by Monday Revolution and what inspired you to write a book about it?
Yeah, it's a very good question, but I do have an answer, which is sort of fortunate, isn't it, really? I do have an answer. We've got two answers, really. One, I'm a great sort of fan of business books, and I like them all, and I read them. I try and get something out. So it's not for everybody, but I do like business books. And I sort of decided probably a few years ago, a lot of them were really just based on one idea. They weren't particularly practical either. It was almost like the people that had written them were writing from the position of theory. They hadn't actually been in the front line and got some stuff done, because I would read business books, business articles and think, well, that isn't going to work, is it? It's great in theory that we should be doing all of this stuff, but actually the real world doesn't operate like that. So I really wanted to create something which was real world driven. That was the thing. And I wanted to really base it on my business life. All the stories in the book, it's not always directly apparent, but all the stories really are stuff that's happened to me over the years. And the things that I've reflected on and sort of learned from those, the things that went well, the things that went badly, So I wanted to write a book. It had been in my head for a long time. And then I was involved with Cass Business School, now renamed Bayes Business School. And the guy I got introduced to, the professor of behavioral organization, and and it was actually at my friend's book launch. And anyway, I got chatting with him, and he said, let's have lunch, and it became quite apparent that he's interested in real world business things, because he said the trouble with business schools is that we don't really do real world. I'm an academic, I've never really worked in business. I'm teaching people on MBA courses, so we need to bring other people in. And, so I said, okay, great. So we started talking about all of that, and we got to know each other a bit. And he said, you've got some great stories. You ought to put them in a book. So I said, okay, because I was just telling stories and went out for lunch. He'd say, do you have an example of this? Yeah, I do. So that was really how it came about. And he advised me on how to write a book and said that, he'd never met anybody that could write just from sort of start to finish. It was something which needed to be continuously improved and crafted. In fact, it's really quite a long process, and he was right. So that's how the book sort of came about. And then I found a publisher that I had to pay. I didn't take it widely, I think, where your book is and everything else. I didn't do that. To be perfectly honest, Christian, I wasn't confident it would be that interested. I was sure of my ego would say, but, turned down. So I thought, well, and so I did it. I've got friends who work in the publishing industry, so I sort of sounded them out. And what I discovered was, A, it wasn't that expensive to do it on your own, and B, actually had a lot more control over it. And one of the frustrations that people seem to have by going to established publishers is that the timing never seems to happen the way it's been described. Oh yeah, we're not launching your book in months. It'll be next year. It all seemed to be quite frustrating and quite old-fashioned. So I met Alison Jones from Inspired Publishing, and I don't think I knew her. I can't remember how I got in touch with her, but anyway, I met her, and we had a sort of half a day scoping out what the book might look like. And unsurprisingly, she was extremely keen because this was money for her, but we talked about it. And that's how it came about, really. And it was called The Monday Revolution because I wanted a book that would really sort of enable people to do things immediately. And so I want to be able to, you could read the book on Friday and go, well, there's some things I can do on Monday. That was the whole point of it. But to be fair, Alison named the book when we were kicking ideas around. She said, that's the book, yes. I said, yeah, that's a great name. So then I got a graphic sort of artist guy who works with another company that I'm involved with. And he did the sort of the graphics, which are sort of based on communist Russia back in the sort of 1940s and stuff. And he did that, which may explain why it's gone quite well in China, because it's, they like sort of red fists, revolutions. So anyway, it's been published in China, and I know at least one person who's bought it.
That amuses me slightly when you talk in those terms, because I sort of think, well, actually, a lot of what you're talking about is removing procedure and bureaucracy and structures that serve no purpose and processes that serve no purpose. So it sort of amuses me that you talk about a country where I suspect there's less of that going on. But I really liked it because, as you say, it comes from a practical place. But to my mind, it's posing some interesting questions, which is sort of, well, why are we doing it this way? And isn't there a better way that we could do it? And as I was saying to you before we started recording, it almost seemed to me that if you took a step back from business and you sort of thought about, well, why is this process being, why is it done this way? Is there a better way we could do it? You would come up with a lot of the thoughts that you have in the book. You wouldn't necessarily have the answers because you need the experience to know that. Because often, there are times when counterintuitive ideas in business will work. But I love the fact you were reducing it to a very human thing and stripping back precisely some of these bureaucratic processes that annoy us all on a human level.
Yeah, I think again it comes back to just sort of stuff that I've done really, and I think the point there you've made is very important, which is we tend to do things the way they've always been done because that's how we do them, and quite often within organisations, I mean, when I joined Capital Radio, I said to people, why were you doing it this way? And they said, well, that's what they want. And I said, well, who are they? Who are they? And they had left years before, but it had just carried on because there was no challenge and nobody, I mean, that's why businesses go bust, really. I mean, if you go and look at the FTSE 100 or whatever, and you go back 50 years, most of those companies don't exist anymore. And they either went bust or they got taken over. But mostly they became weak. And they became weak because they became bureaucratic and layered, and they carried on doing the things that they'd always done. And that was the problem. The big challenge for organizations is to constantly question what they're doing and see whether there's a better way of doing it. I mean, I say it in the book, you should look around and see what else is going on. You can't just have an internal introspective view. Well, you can, but if you do, you're going to fail ultimately because other people will find better ways of doing things. It happens all the time. And so one of the challenges organizations have, which I try and put in my book, is don't just accept for what it is. Try and find some better ways of doing things. And sure, if it isn't you, go outside the organization, find those companies and steal their ideas.
one of the things that really does come across is a willingness to admit when you've got things wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that admitting that one's made mistakes and learning from those, right, is on the one hand, we know that as kids that's what we should do. We're taught that that's sensible. On the other hand, it's really hard to do. And I was struck that at the heart of your approach, it seemed to me, was one, a willingness to recognize that we don't know everything and therefore we need help and support. And the second thing was to recognize that we're going to screw stuff up, and that's part of the nature of things. And so all of this stuff is, rather than thinking we've got it all sorted, is we're almost engaged in a constant experiment. And so your comment around looking for ideas from else, paying attention to what's going on, not sticking to the tried and tested just because that's all we've done, seemed to be part of it. So in many respects, I mean, you were working with some very established companies, but you seem to have a very entrepreneurial approach to things.
Yeah, I'm not saying for a second that these things are easy. I mean, I can think of a couple of examples. Again, when I was at Capital, where I hired a guy who to build our sort of online internet business. And he was very unconventional compared with who we were not. He looked unconventional. He wore a suit with trainers, outrageous, and stuff. And he spoke a different language and used different vocabulary and everything. And I couldn't get him accepted within my top senior team. They just looked at him like an anomaly, and also he had very big budgets. They didn't like that either, so because it was a sort of bet. So that didn't really work out very well. It's very hard to get people to break convention. And then another time I decided that actually, why don't we go and hunt for some new talent in different places? And they all breathe the same air also. I mean, it's not healthy. So I decided to send our entrepreneurial creative program guy to the Edinburgh Festival. I said, go there for a week and find some talent, that might not have done radio, but he went and found some talent, but he couldn't break through, even though he was in charge, he couldn't break through the barriers, People didn't want to know. They just wanted to carry on. So it's very difficult to break these things down. And quite often, and you will see this, it's adversity that makes people change because they need something needs to happen. Otherwise, why would you bother?
The bit that struck me when you were introducing the book and certainly reading it was, as you say, it's very practical steps. So there's a lot of stuff in there that's kind of big picture thinking, but also it's like as you said. I mean, I would even argue you could start reading it on a Monday morning on your commute into work, and there'd be things you could action. It's that level of practical. And so the thing I think is interesting is you're right is that we tend to shift when we have a big a big event occurs and we get an opportunity to change things. But actually, many of the things that hold us back, both as individuals and organizations, are just what you might term bad habits, right? Stuff that we've just been doing forever. And so I like this idea of taking advantage of change as and when things come. So not being fair, something goes wrong, right? Let's just learn from that. Or there's a change in the landscape of the environment, let's learn from it. But let's also look at some of our little habits that we have, some of the things that we take for granted, and just question those in very small ways. And so one of the things I really took away was in your practical steps, was that there are some very basic questions where you can start to ask, well, why are we doing it this way? Why am I doing it this? And I compared it, and take this the right way, I compared it almost to a sort of one of these diet exercise type books where, you want people to make small, so couch to 5K equivalents, right? Small steps in order to make the bigger changes happen. And so I thought that was very interesting because a lot of the books, as you say, a lot of the business books, they sort of paint a big bold picture, but it's like, well, how the hell do I get from my day-to-day existence here unless one of those big changes that you talked about occurs, and then we have the opportunity or we're forced into it. But actually some of these baby steps, smaller things can be greatly transformative if you just start to tackle them.
Yeah, I mean, at the back of the book, Professor Cliff, he has a chapter at the back, and he talks about James Clear and atomic steps, and that's become a very popular book because it enables people to take small steps and do stuff. I mean, the problem with small steps is you don't get the gratification as quickly as you want, So, I mean, someone who is significantly unhealthy, they have some sort of semi-heart attack or whatever, and they think, oh, right, I need to stop smoking, I need to lose some weight, I need to get on with it. And they tend to go into an extreme position. So they live on sort of 500 calories a day, and they survive 2 weeks, then they just go back to what they've done before because it's just not sustainable. And so one of the challenges that we all have really is what can we put in place that will allow us to take those small steps and build up as we go. and have we got enough belief in ourselves that we can do that? Are we prepared to stick with it and just say, okay, can we recognize those moments and say, oh, this is one of those moments, and I told myself I wasn't going to do this, or I was going to do it different. Now I'm going to do that. Or do we make excuses and go, I'm really tired, I'm really hungry, or it's someone's birthday. I said I wouldn't drink in January, but I mean it's their birthday. So we find all these reasons why we shouldn't do it, and that's why people find it very difficult to change. And so therefore, unsurprisingly, organisations find it difficult to change because change is hard, so therefore, if you can put sort of small processes in place that says, well, we're now going to do it like this, we're now going to do it like that, new protocols, or within organisations, when you try and change stuff, you always get pushback from people. They always go, oh, I liked it the old way. I mean, when I can remember moving people from one building to another, and the people that were in the old building all went, oh, yeah, I mean, this new building, it hasn't got the atmosphere as the old building. The old building was just great. We loved coming in there. It had, the culture was really good and everything else. And I said, well, you've forgotten this, but I was in the old building with you and you hated it. You hated it. It didn't have any air conditioning. It was on a noisy road. It was crammed. There wasn't enough space. The meeting rooms, the catering was terrible. You've forgotten all those things now. You're just looking back. And then it isn't the way that you're describing it. So, yeah, it's hard. But I mean, if you can pick things out of the book, I mean, one of the things which has sort of become, quite popular, which I'll come on to, is the fact that at the end of each chapter, I just sort of put a little checklist of things that you could do starting on Monday. So here's some different things that you could do, and you can do them now. So why not?
And I love that because I thought you've got, as you're illustrating now, you've got some great stories to tell. And one of the things I always think is really interesting is when you get sort of, let's have a famous sports person or business person to talk to us, inspirational speaker. And they talk about climbing Everest or whatever it happens to be. And you kind of go, well, that's interesting. But I'm planning on doing that. So we do need to bring it down to that. Well, what does that mean for me? And so I think the story, in a way, you're sort of telling stories a bit like parables in the sense of here's something that happened, but here's what you then do with that. And so I love that linkage of the story's what I remember. And there's some great stories in there, but it's actually, what do I then do with that? Well, I can't reenact the story for myself unless I happen to find myself in your position. So I love that practical steps idea.
Yeah, I think this is something which you seem to sort of learn over time, and it is back to that sort of cliche. If only I sort of could recognize these things now, or then rather, because. When you're in a busy career and you're sort of just stuff's happening all the time, things are flying at you, you don't really have those sort of time for reflection. You don't really sort of go, okay, well, that went really well or that went really badly. So what can I capture from that? What can I do different? What could I do to make that particular occasion something that I can apply elsewhere? And we don't tend to do that. It's only when we get a bit more time and maybe get a bit older, a bit more experience that we realise that reflecting back on what happened is a really great sort of learning experience. I mean, if you take sort of risk, I remember when I was in the broader Carphone warehouse, Charles Dunstan, the founder, sort of big shareholder of the company. Now he used to get really bored with sort of registers, because obviously we had to have one, we had to do it. And he said the reason that I don't like having this conversation is that nothing on the risk register will ever happen. Right? It's all the stuff that isn't on the risk register. Then he trotted out what had happened. BA, I think at the time, where SARS had happened, and then an oil depot that provided fuel for the airline had burnt down, whatever, and so basically, he reeled off a list of things that weren't on their list. So it was almost a sort of case of, well, what's the point, But, I think that there is, what you do is you bring those things alive. They need humanizing. No one wants to talk about catastrophe. No one wants to talk about things going wrong. Everyone, we are built to be very positive. But we also know that, I was talking to an entrepreneur this week who I know very well, who's got a very interesting business. She was talking about me investing in it. And, I've never seen a business plan for an entrepreneur that got anywhere near the numbers that they put in it. I mean, nowhere near the numbers, and that's a sort of significant risk, unless they project those things in a very positive way, people won't invest. So people almost expect to be lied to in order to put their money in, I mean, and if you don't in a business plan, an early stage business plan, if you don't make it ambitious enough, it says the wrong things about you as a person. You're not driven anything else. But if you make it ridiculously ambitious, then you're stupid. So you try and tread some 3-year middle ground. Everyone's so we're all sort of playing a game here, really. And I think risk registers, in a way, are sort of a bit like that. People don't really believe, people don't really engage with. That's why they need you, because it needs to be a different, as we were saying earlier, a more realistic, a more human approach to these things. Because when you read Black Swan, you just know that forecasting is for fools, because you can never forecast anything. I've just written a piece about how companies make decisions and how individuals make decisions, and what decisions, generally speaking, require is some sort of perfect knowledge, and actually what we have is no knowledge in most instances. Beyond today, really, we don't know. So you're going to make a strategic decision to build a railway line from Birmingham to Manchester, and so you're going to hire lots of consultants, and they're going to give you their best and worst case scenarios as to what that's going to be. So you've got the boundaries and the parameters, and therefore you can get a budget approved, within that. And then actually what happens is it doesn't go anything like that at all. And that happens all the time with decisions, happens all the time when companies buy companies. I mean, I don't know if you saw, but, in the business press, there's a new guy at Unilever who's decided to rationalize the portfolio, sell off some of the businesses. The businesses they spent billions on, Dollar Shave Company, they spent $1 billion on it. And they won't say what they're selling it for, because they're selling it for nothing. And they spent $1 billion on it. And at the time, it made sense. It was taking them into the world of consumer subscription businesses. But it's a disaster. But the thing that's really annoying about these chief executives is that they're sort of holding our pension funds. And, the guy from Rolls-Royce recently stood up and said, the new guy at Rolls-Royce, I'm staying on a burning platform. Every deal that we've done in the last few years has destroyed shareholder value. In other words, the money would have been better left in the bank than wasting it on acquisitions and terrible investments that have just not delivered anything like the returns that they forecast. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, I'm a shareholder. I'm my pension fund will have Rolls-Royce shares in it. And what was the last guy doing that? He's probably earning $5 million a year. And Unilever just come out with the same thing, So the new guy is sort of going, well, the last guy was really useless. All that stuff about putting trees and dolphins on banks of margarine, not doing any of that. We've got to get back to the core business where the money is, so we're going to sell off all his vanity projects. So we're, can't be right, can it?
I laugh because, those are just two examples, right? But we see this all the time. And we can add politics to the mix of it. Oh, that last like a shower. And in some cases, that is, of course, true. But, there seems to be this perennial thing. We don't have the systems in place that either get the right people into the positions, or if we have got the right people into decisions, and we're often fishing in very, shallow pools for that, the processes that we've put in place, be it things like quarterly reporting, for example, don't deliver the outcomes that we want. And so in many respects, we're set up to fail, I would argue, in some cases, given the way these problems are approached.
Yeah. What we don't have in many instances, particularly at the corporate levels, is we don't have processes for making decisions, right? There aren't any sort of, at least some basic protocols. So If a company's going to go and make, I mean, I talked to someone the other day who was involved in the acquisition of Argos by Sainsbury's, which looked like a weird thing at the time. Sort of why they buy the catalogue business, that seems to be buried in the 1970s, why is that a good idea? And it's turned out to be a terrible deal, of course, predictably, it's a terrible deal. And he said, well, because we fell in love with it. So I would argue, where were the checks and balances, back into your world, who was looking at the risks in all of that? Who, what should have happened for someone to sort of say, right, well, actually, this isn't a great idea, or it is a great idea, or at least we ought to be taking these certain things into account. Where were the devil's advocates? The problem with a lot of this stuff is there's nobody independent in the room. So you're the chief executive and the CFO or the finance director, and you want to make a deal because it's exciting. Otherwise, it's boring. You sit in the audit committee. So you want to make a deal because that's how you get judged. You're building the business growth, positions, all the rest of it. You want to go and do that, and there's nobody in the room that's going to stop you, because the other people in the room are bankers and lawyers and corporate finance people and corporate comms people, and they all love you doing a deal. Like, nobody's ever going to tell you this is a bad idea. Right? And you go to your board and you go, this is what we should be doing. And the board, they might ask a few questions, but basically you've covered them off before you got to the board meeting, because you went and saw them individually and gave them, an hour presentation, which lined up with the strategy they'd agreed at a board meeting 6 months ago. So you took the acquisition to them individually. So by the time they're all sitting in the room, they've all been covered off. And then you go, and someone says, yeah, but supposing that, what's the worst case scenario? Oh, yeah, I'm glad you asked me that, because here is the worst case scenario. I've got it on a chart. And even under the worst case scenario, this is still a great deal. And we go, well, okay, good. Right, let's get on with it then. But actually, most deals destroy shareholder value. Most deals don't work. Synergies don't show up. The culture doesn't happen. The numbers weren't right, and so on and so forth. And, my sort of thesis on all of this stuff really is that there isn't adequate process in place. But the trouble is that chief executives don't want process, really. They say they do, but they don't really. What they really want is to be valued for their experience and their power. That's what happens, So we might start off with a sort of rational approach to doing a deal, buying a business or whatever. Yeah. So the analysts have done all the numbers. Here they all are. You do all that sort of stuff. But along the way, it gets very noisy because there are politics and power and bias and dodgy evidence and a lot of other things. A lot of noise happens and becomes very confusing. So what started out as a quite simple process actually gets a bit lost. And at the end of it, people forget. And I had this great example, Christian, this week, was a guy who I know very well, who wasn't looking to sell his business, and he got approached by a company who said, we'd like to buy your business. We're really keen. And they're a very good company, and that you can see why it would make sense. So he said, well, they definitely need us, and we're going to solve their problem because, they don't really know what they're doing. They've gone to this new area, they spent millions on it, it's not working for them. And they come to us because we know what to do. We can unlock the door here. We can do this. So that's great. However, I'm not looking to sell, and therefore I want 10 million quid in my pocket, or this isn't okay. So the company start to ask some general sort of performance questions of the business, and things go on and everything. And what happens is, the chief executive, suddenly they push back on valuation, and they start pushing back on stuff. And the chief executive has lost sight of the reasons that they were going to buy it in the first place, because he's now just focusing on his 10 million quid. And he's going, well, I don't really want to go back on that because they might walk away. And you go, but originally you said, this was a really important deal for them because this was going to just generate the value they never saw. But he'd forgotten about all of that because he was now focusing on something else. And you see this happen all the time in deals with chief executives who go, yeah, I think my intuition tells me I should be doing this. So they move from a fact-based, rational approach to an intuitive, gut-based decision. Not all the time. And those things, and intuition is present throughout the process. But this is often what happens. That's what happened with Sainsbury's and Argos.
And there's something interesting about experience, I find, because on the one hand, if you have no experience of something, the chances of screwing it up are relatively high. Well, we know that if you think about, I don't know, you take up skiing, there's a stronger likelihood of you falling over, having an accident when you don't know what you're doing. But we then get to that tipping point of where a lot of knowledge, actually a lot of experience, particularly if you've been hired and told you have that experience, you've been given a role as a result of it, that can blind us to those things as well. So I'm always struck that there's probably an optimal point of still recognizing that you don't know enough and that you need help and you want to think about things. But equally, you don't want to be inexperienced. And it seems to me a lot of the things you're talking about, particularly when we look at sort of highly paid people, there's a tendency to believe your own hype because that's what you've been told, that's what you're being paid for. And so that's where experience is unhelpful. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that tipping point.
Well, yeah, I think, there are countless corporate examples of where, the chief executive, has anyone, and I can think of two companies, private companies that were founder led, very successful businesses, so multi-million pound businesses started by the founder. And I sat on the board of one of those and advised the other. And the founder did not want to know anything from anybody else around the table. And it's almost like, his view was, well, I'm worth several hundred million and you're not worth anything because you can't be as smart as me. So he basically, both of them actually, he got rid of anybody that was a challenging voice, including me actually in one of those instances, because I would say, well, how are we going to decide? Or can you just explain why that's a good idea? And quite often I wouldn't be very smart about how I asked those questions. They would be quite confrontational. So that didn't help my case. And that's a good example, actually, Christian, of how I've tried to improve, by finding better ways of asking questions without pushing people into a corner, which I used to be very good at. When I was on the board of Carphone, John Gildersleeve, ex-Tesco guy, very difficult, hard. I basically asked the question, just sort of said, why are we spending all this money on advertising at Christmas when we don't seem to be able to serve the people that are coming into the shops? Wouldn't it be better to cut back on the advertising and get more staff? Then we'd have more satisfied customers. There must be a point on a graph, where we could do this. And everyone looked at me and the chairman said, why do you always ask the difficult questions?
Because that's what I'm paid to do.
I said, I thought that's what I was here for. And he said, it's not. And it wasn't. They didn't want me to ask difficult questions. I was there because they needed non-executive directors there. So I don't want to sound, I had a great time at Carphone Warehouse Board, but I learned a lot of stuff and I did make a contribution. But, there are those sort of situations where people don't really want to listen. So if you want to be a really effective chief executive or a leader in any capacity, the question that you need to ask is, what's the counter view? What should I be doing here? So if you take the approval of drugs, for example, or academic papers, they are peer group reviewed by people who don't have any commercial interest in whether the paper is right or wrong. They're quite simply looking at it from a sort of evidence-based point of view and saying, are we prepared to put our name to this? Is it something we agree to? So that's really smart. But in organizations, in decision-making, generally speaking, they don't have peer group reviews. So they don't go to independent people, not advisors, but maybe people in the company who aren't involved in the deal and say, right, we're going to give you some information here. What do you think? Amazon, and I don't know if they do it, but this is something which companies do talk about in decision-making. And I think 99.9% of companies would never do it. But Bezos apparently, he gets everybody in the room. They all spend half an hour reading, the sort of same paper in terms of laying out what it is they're going to talk about. And then he wants views from around the table, and he starts with the most junior person. So he doesn't lead the views, because otherwise people will just go with it. That's the thinking. Now, That isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than what happens in lots of places. And I say in my book, evidence-based decision making. Before we decide, how do we really know? And I do a lot of sort of advisory work and coaching work and stuff. And I've learned how, I think, to ask better questions, really, and frame questions in a better way. I don't use the word why, for example, because it puts people on the back foot. So if I say, why have you done this? People get defensive. So you would reframe things in a different way, So you might say, okay, so you've just said to me that didn't go as well as you thought. What might have you done different? If you had your time again, how would you review that now? What would you reflect on? I said to my daughter at the weekend, who's starting a business, I said to her, how will you decide? She said, Dad, you're coaching me again. Yeah.
I said,
Yeah, I am.
and most
But
people pay me for this, so you're lucky I'll get it for free.
You'll pay me as the investment comes off. But it's a good question, really. How will you decide? Yeah. So there's a guy sent me a text this morning. He and I are in the business together, and he said, this is the situation, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I've looked at it and I said, I'm happy to support your decision. I don't want him to come to me all the time. Stuff, if it was a great big thing and I had a really strong view, of course I would do that, but I think, I try to avoid giving advice. Daniel Kahneman says he doesn't do forecasts. And I try not to give advice to people because actually, when you give advice to people, they tend to sort of pick the bits that they believe in or the thing that they were going to do, whatever. And so it's not always that helpful, So if you can help people discover the information for themselves and then make a decision, it makes them better people. Back to what you're talking earlier about reflection.
I think that's super interesting because you're only going to properly follow advice on a sustainable basis that you can support, because that nagging voice is going to go, I don't buy into this. And so I love that idea of helping people to solve the problem themselves rather than you're handing down the stone tablets from on, this is what you need to do. And so it's, as you say, it's one, it's in the presentation of being much less confrontational, but two, I think if you want sustainable solutions, then people are only going to stick with something they firmly believe in. And actually that makes you someone that's much more valuable because you're putting them in a position to be able to think about these things themselves again, as opposed to, oh Christ, I've got another one of those problems. I better go talk to David about how I solve this one. And so there's a sort of dependency on you in theory in that model. Whereas what you're talking about is it's the equivalent of the, you can teach someone you can give someone fish or you can teach them how to fish. And I love that sort of thinking, because I think all too often we see this kind of, let's go and talk to the experts. And then we have to get the experts in the room to be like, well, the experts aren't always going to be there. And actually, you need to have a degree of and you need to know that you're not going to have moments of doubt, that you can back yourself, because there are going to be times where things get a bit choppy. And so having a strategy you've bought into yourself, I think is fast. So I love that. I love that way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think there's lots of little sort of tools like that that one can sort of develop and use. And that's what I try to put in my book, really. Just ask some different questions or better questions. Don't jump in. We're great at jumping in, We've got a friend who's, going through a difficult time in a relationship and stuff, and everybody is offering their personal view, So, they're all offering legally, this is what's here, but they could well be wrong because they're not lawyers. Legally, I think this is this. And if I was you, I'd be doing that and everything else, and the person involved was completely confused because she's getting all this very well-meaning advice. Some of it is based on experiences that other people have had, but none of it might be right for her. So asking her better questions as to what she's thought about and what's important to, and going to see a lawyer to know pretty early on, exactly what the position is, would be much better for than, in an emotional time where she's confused. But people don't think about it like that because they're well-meaning and they go, right, this is my advice. When I was in this situation, this is what I did. I changed the locks and cut him out of my will.
And I think that's interesting, right? Because like even if it would turn out to be good advice, at that point, if you're telling your own story and rerunning what you've done, well, the situation may be completely different, and you're just going to find the parallels that may not exist. And I think there's this temptation to assume that one's own experience must automatically be valuable for someone else. Well, it might be, but it might not be. I'm always struck with travel. You get this thing where people say, you must go to these places. And so I think, well, that presupposes that my interests are entirely aligned with yours, and actually that nothing has changed. That the restaurant particularly when we've got things like the pandemic, right? The restaurant may have been amazing before the pandemic, might be bloody awful now. And so I think what you're talking about here really, as I think out loud, David, is a bit more agency for the individuals that you're, and I was going to say advising, but I think counselling might be better, or supporting or coaching through the situation, because then there's a sense that they're making the decision themselves, and that's much more appealing than being told what to do.
I think so. Although there is another side to that. I mean, there's a lady that I coach, and early on in the relationship, she said, she's Australian, and she is typical of what you would expect an Australian commercial lady to be like. She's very forthright, hard hitting. And, she says what she thinks. And she just said, "Can I stop you there?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." She said, "These questions you're asking me, David, I think you know the answers." And I said, "Right." She said, "So I've presented a problem. You've asked me more questions, but I think you know what the answer to my problem is." She said, "So it would be so much quicker if you could just tell me, then we could move on. And, I'd get more value out of this meeting because we could talk about something else as opposed to you sort of keep asking me questions." And I said, "Well, I completely accept that point. I have to. Sure, I won the business off the back of my CV, and obviously it's quite long, so I'm quite old. There's a lot of stuff there. And sure, I have been in the situations that to some extent would mirror yours. So, but I don't have the context that if I apply what happened to me or what I would do to the situation you're in, it could be right, but it could be wrong. And so therefore I'm reluctant to do that. But here's the deal, and I learned this early on. This is what I do now with other people. I just sort of say, look, I'm very happy to give you a view at the end of our conversation. And I'll do that then, but really it needs you to describe everything and for you to think it's, because I'll give you a better view when I've heard all of that. And that's for everybody, that's enough. People go, yeah, sure.
I'm now being cautious about the questions I ask you, but I'll ask it anyway. You were talking about the way you've evolved, and obviously the David Mansfield of X years ago may not be won't be the exact same one of today. But how do you pick which companies you go and work? Because you've talked about frustrating experiences where you've been hired because of your experience, and you've been very, very successful. And so, how do you decide who you want to work with? What are the criteria you're looking for there?
Just a question you're asking on your own behalf.
No, I'm genuinely intrigued, because I imagine someone like you gets lots of people approaching them, and so you talked about your board experiences where it was sort of you might have thought, well, I'm here to give lots of advice, but actually they don't want to listen. And so I wonder, because you strike me as being somebody who, of course we all like to earn money, but you've been successful. So my guessing is you'll be doing things that give you a sense of purpose, and you want to get well rewarded for it and all that sort of thing. But fundamentally, you want to know that you can be the best version of you and deliver something. And so, actually, it was more of a question about, if a company came along and said, "Would you sit on our board?" What would your thought process be? Now, how would you answer that question as to whether this is somewhere where you can make a difference on your terms?
Yeah, and it's a very, very good question, and I can answer it on the basis of mistakes. So when I stopped being chief executive of Capital Radio, I was 52 and I'm 69 now, so it's quite a long time ago, 17 years ago. Right? So, and I couldn't imagine doing anything that was as enjoyable as that. I mean, it was just great, really. So I had a look around, and I was lucky enough to be offered things, but there was nothing there that came close to it, So I decided I would sort of pursue a portfolio career, and people were coming to me and saying, "Can you give me some advice?" And stuff. So I started, I suppose, effectively, a sort of consultancy sort of thing by accident. So I started to join some boards as a non-exec, like Carphone and other ones, whatever. Um, and as a consultant, I started taking on assignments, and um, uh, I got a lot of those things wrong in the early days. I mean, I learned a lot, and they provided me with great material and examples of stuff. And I can talk about big board meetings because I've sat around the tables, which is really important to do that if you're going to get credibility with people who are sitting around tables, who you're trying to advise. But basically, I said yes to lots of things that I shouldn't have said yes to. So I didn't enjoy them very much. They didn't really play to the things that I was interested in. People didn't really want my contribution around a board table. They just wanted non-execs because they had to have them. So, and then I would take on consultancy that, I love the thrill of the chase. Right? I love pitching. I love going up against Deloitte and winning, and they go, well, we want David because, he's our guy, and whatever. And then when you get in there, you realize that what you're going to have to do is horrible. It isn't something you want to do. You're sitting in an airless room, EY at London Bridge for 4 hours with 20 people who don't know who you are, don't want to see you there. And, it all, and so I'm very guilty of saying yes to things for money and saying yes to things because it plays to my sort of ego and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So I have become far better at avoiding the traps of that. And sometimes, smaller businesses in particular want you because of your connections, So I've got involved in smaller businesses. And then once they've had your connections, there's no future role, but you're sort of still there. So I've become quite wary and discerning. And so I'm more, I mean, I'm quite busy doing stuff at the moment, so I'm not really looking for anything, but now I know exactly what I would like to do. I mean, coaching is a very good thing to do because you don't have to do a lot of talking, which is good. You just listen to people, you ask them questions. It's very rewarding when you see people, get a benefit and grow. I really enjoy that. It doesn't require huge amounts of preparation. You're not putting together decks or reading management accounts or whatever. In fact, you're particularly encouraged, not to do a lot of work because you need to meet the person and they present whatever it is they want to talk about. So you don't want to go there with preconceived ideas. I mean, one of the guys that taught me when I did all this professional qualification stuff a couple of years ago, he sort of said, he got to the point where he never says anything other than, how are you? And sometimes didn't even ask that. So the opening question would be, hi, Christian, what would you like to talk about today?
Wow.
And that would be it. And then the conversation would go. And you might go, well, I've been really busy. I haven't really thought of anything. You go, well, if you hadn't been really busy, what might you have thought of?
In the parallel universe that we're now living in.
So I do enjoy it. And one of the things I do, which I is one of the most challenging things, I say to people, you've got to get outside your comfort zone. You only learn really when you're scared. You only learn when you're scared. And as we get older, we don't like being scared, so we don't do that. We don't climb trees. We try and mitigate the scariness from our lives. And also in my generation, I'm very grumpy as well. So I try to make sure that A, I'll still get scared, and B, I don't get grumpy. It's very important not to be grumpy. So I do speakers for schools. So that's Robert Peston's charity, and it's just for state schools. And I go and speak at state schools probably 3 times a year. And they the brief is usually pretty difficult because they don't really think about it very much. They have lots of speakers coming in. So, yeah, sure, David, just bring your PowerPoint and come and do your stuff. And I go, well, I don't know a PowerPoint. Oh, wow. Well, students are used to seeing pictures of birds and lions. And, the last guy came in, he'd been on a world travel trip. I go, well, yeah, I've done that. So, and you never know what you're going to get. And so I stand there in front of 150 students in a gym in Merton on a wet Monday afternoon, thinking, why didn't I say yes to this? And, it could be really short. And the teacher's already told me you won't get any questions because there's 15 to 17-year-old girls who are all too self-conscious, so they won't. So I think, right, well, it's going to have to happen, otherwise it is going to be very short. It's only talk for 15 minutes and an hour's thing. So it's all conversational. So I go and do those things. It goes all right. I've done it a lot. But I tell the story, but it's a very human story. So I tell the story about what went wrong a lot, what I might have done differently, what I think about. And back to the point you were making much earlier, I deliberately don't highlight the achievements of superstars because kids particularly, they can't relate to those people. We might all want to be, a superstar footballer, like or whoever it happens to be. We might all want to be like that, but it's so far out of reach for us. As a reference point for most people, it's very difficult. It's not the real world. So I try and, like my book, I try and do everything in the real world. This is how it is really. Come on, guys. We might say all that shit, but actually, this is how the world really works. This is how decisions get made. This is how people get hired. Right? They might start off with this, job description which says we want somebody that's like this, and this, that. Yeah, perfect. HR have signed it off. Compliance have signed it. Yeah, it's all done. And then when the person walks in the room, they haven't got a number of those things. It becomes apparent, but you still hire them because you liked them.
But it's interesting there, isn't it? Because there's sort of dishonesty on both sides, right? Because so the job spec is never going to say, we want you to not speak up in meetings because we're not about that. And we want you to do some tedious bureaucratic thing, right? So the job spec is putting the shine on what the job involves. And then equally, the candidate is encouraged to to sort of, pump up their own experience and the things that they were doing. So you've got this sort of PR hell, if you like, in the middle, where, as to your point, on both sides, there's bullshit. And so then you have the reality of these two worlds colliding, and then we see what happens. And I think it's fascinating when we think about structures, encouraging, back to your start point, it encourages those sort of myths. If I look at annual appraisals, is a sort of confrontational thing where talk about your successes this year. And even and it's same in interviews, even when you're encouraged to talk about things that have gone wrong, weaknesses, so what are your weaknesses? Well, I show too much attention to detail. Some nonsense that is not a weakness.
Yeah. Well, that's right. But if you think about that, if you stand back from those situations, most people, when you were employed in your job, part of your interview wasn't, okay, I need to talk to you about how good you are at selecting your team. What experience do you have as an interviewer? How do you decide? What models would you use? Are you familiar with Myers-Briggs, for example? Would you use that? How would you, what about Gallup's strengths tests? I personally find that quite useful. No one has that conversation at an interview. So what tends to happen is we are taking people who become managers, and over 80% of people are never trained in management in this country anyway. None of we're taking people who have really no experience, and then we're saying, go and hire some people. So it's not surprising that, and there isn't, it's back to my sort of being my bonnet really, there isn't, and this isn't the same everywhere, of course, but quite often there isn't a process for deciding. And because there isn't a process, people will do it on intuition. I know people who just say, yeah, well, I know it when I see it. I've got friends who would say, yeah, I don't need any of that. I don't need any of that because I know it when I see it. Go, right, okay. And then you look at who they've hired, and they hired everybody who's a bit like them. They'd like to go on holiday with all of them. So, that and that's why these things happen, because there isn't a sort of process. There isn't something in place which at least is a map, a sort of guide. I mean, you may not stick to it. You may still decide to do the thing, but at least there might have been a starting point there, which would help you make some decisions. I mean, one of the things that I do work with a company, where between us, we've made lots of sort of recruitment errors. So every time we have somebody, we go, well, what should we have done differently? What could we have done? Because, we had a guy who ticked all the boxes. We gave him some tests. We had tests and stuff and everything. But when he turned up, he was lazy. He would come in dead on 9:30, leave dead on 5 o'clock. And he didn't really do much in between. He's like on social media and telling stories, but he didn't actually do very much. And we sort of thought, how can we test that at an interview? What could we have done that meant we didn't hire him?
Right, because you're not going to demonstrate that in an interview. You're going to be in your best behaviour, right?
Yeah. So what could we do? And it's quite difficult. I mean, that is perhaps when you do have psychometric tests or whatever, but lots of companies don't have that facility and they don't have the license to operate and stuff. So, but I think every company should be able to look at their hiring policy, because at the end of the day, it's the most important thing they do. Hiring is the most important. I wrote a series of blogs about it because it just, I sort of felt I should sort of say, how do you hire good people? Well, first, people go, oh yeah, it's really difficult to get good people. Well, that's wrong. It isn't really good. It isn't really difficult to get good people. It's really difficult finding a process to get good people. So that's the first thing you need to do is you need to say, right, I need people to do these things. I need these skills here. This is what I've got. Here's what the gaps are. So what can I do in the selection to try and make that work? And that will come down to some basic stuff. Like, what does the job look like? I mean, I give a talk at London Stock Exchange to a course that they run about hiring teams, and high performance teams. They give me the name of every company that's going to attend this, and let's say 20 companies represented by senior people. So what I do, to them is I go and look at all their websites. And then I stand at the front of the room and I go, well, I've looked at all your websites, because if I was a potential high-flying employee, that's where I would start. I would want to go and see what your company's about. And you can see the people crumble in the room because they know that what I've looked at is terrible. And there's I'm thinking of one instance, where there were two companies, and one company had got all their values, which was just sort of platitudes. This you can expect. We've all been there, haven't we? We've all stood, on the other side of the sort of desk where they've got the customer service charter behind them. And obviously the person we're talking to has never read it. We treat people with respect in a timely manner and everything. Right. You don't.
Yeah.
I mean, and so, you in this particular example, you've got one company which just got a load of platitudes, which didn't really mean anything. But another company had their values, but then they had video of what their teams were actually doing for those values. So we said that we want to support a local charity. Here we are giving up our weekend to go do this stuff. We said that we believe in these things. Here's an example of our recycling stuff that we do. Here's how we, and that sort of stuff's really important. I mean, when I was at Capital, we had a lot, because all our radio stations were local. They had a role to play in the local community. It's important. They did that. And so we made that part of the appraisal process. So it wasn't all about numbers. We sort of said, well, we expect you to make a contribution to the local community. And they said, well, what does that mean? We said, well, it might mean, running a local interest group. It might be being a parent governor. It might be some other sort of social activity. But we expect you to be able to demonstrate it. And those are some things that we will look for. And by the way, you will, your pay will reflect whether you've done it. Because we learn quite on that, soft things don't get done, but if you collect money, then they do.
Magically, they happen. But I love what you've just said there, about set the vision, but you've actually given your people the ability to do what they want. Because it always struck me, back to your community project, often organizations go, right, we believe in supporting the community. Let's all go and paint a school playground or something, right? Which, and often people will do a crap job because actually they're not qualified to paint or build or whatever, right? So it's a sort of slightly pointless, it's very self-indulgent. But I loved what you said there because that was basically, okay, here's the big picture thing that we want you to do, but you go work out what that means for you. And I loved the sense of agency that was there because I could see enforced community projects or participation in things. That's fine if it happens to float your boat, but if it really doesn't, you're there against and you're not going to be engaged with it. Whereas what you were basically saying was, we'll set general direction. You've got to be able to demonstrate you're doing it. I'm not having any bullshit here about, I've done this, 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 and this, or I need to demonstrate. But have the freedom to decide for yourself what that means.
Yeah, I think so. It's back to the coaching point, really, Christian, isn't it? It's not telling people what to do. It's asking them questions, or at least painting a picture and saying, well, if you get that, I mean, part of working here, this is what it's about. This is what we've made it clear. This is what we do. And unlike companies who just stick labels on walls, we actually want to live this. So it's very important that everyone takes part in it in some capacity. So here's some ideas. Here's what people in the organization do. You can have the time to go and do it, or maybe even a little budget, but go and do it. And that was what we did. And people can be given far more responsibility than they're often sort of given credit for. Really. But equally, if you run a sort of control and command thing, I mean, I would say that the most common challenge that younger managers have, that people that I work with, is they are overwhelmed by the problems of the people that report to them. And the reason they're overwhelmed is that they take those problems on themselves. Years ago there was, the 1 Minute Manager Meets the Monkey, and it's a great sort of story, really, because, it's a lady sitting in the office on a Saturday afternoon looking out a window, watching all their staff playing golf on the local golf course. And she sort of wonders why she's in the office and they're out there. And the answer is that they manage her, because they come to her going, well, I can't get hold of Christian, and until I get hold of him, I can't do the things you've asked me to do. And she goes, well, I know Christian really well, so leave it with me and I'll open that door. But she's really busy because she's trying to open all these different doors and do her job. And so a week later, how's the project going? Well, it actually hasn't gone anywhere because you were going to get in touch with Christian and you haven't done it. Oh yeah, we'll do that. So who's reporting to who now? Who's reporting to who? Well, we know the answer. Right? So, and so when people say to me, okay, David, well, because we think that that's a responsibility of management. We think that management is solving other people's problems, where it isn't, really. They're not going to learn. So the question that I say to people, when the people go to them with this stuff, I says, well, why don't you answer them a question, which is, well, what have you thought of? What have you considered? What do you see the options? What do you need to take into account? What do you know and what don't you know? So coaching them to come up with their own answers. And once you start to do that, they realize there's no point in keep turning up with their problems and saying, solve it. Because it's not going to work. They're going to have to go and do the work. It is back to the old cliche, really, of, don't bring me your problems, bring me your solutions. But, a little bit deeper.
Love that. Final thought for you, because I given some of the listeners the show, and I can't let you go with that. I mean, you've worked in some heavily regulated industries. I mean, radio's a good example. I wondered how you approach that, because it struck me, particularly if you're in a creative industry, that you could look at regulation and say that's a pain in the neck. And let's start with what you're allowed to say on air and sort of thing. Did you find that regulation was it in any way useful, helpful to you as a constraint that you could riff off? Was it a pain in the neck? What's your sort of general view on it in terms of how that, because often it's seen as an obstacle to business?
Yeah, I didn't see it as an obstacle for business. I mean, I didn't have a particularly good, well, actually it's not true. When there was an organization called the Radio Authority, I didn't have a very good relationship with those people because more to do with the personalities that were involved in it. They were just the wrong people. But however, contrast that with Ofcom. When Ofcom started, and Stephen Carter, Lord Carter it is now, he runs Informer. I mean, when he and Ed Richards took over at Ofcom, it was a completely different think, because particularly Stephen, he'd come from advertising and WPP and stuff, he could see both sides, right? He could see the commercial imperative that was required, and he knew that Ofcom's job wasn't sitting there saying, oh, it was an enabling organisation which had very strict rules, but it needed to be enabling. It needed to promote a healthy media sector. And so you could have proper conversations with him and his team about those things. So I'm not anti-regulation. I think regulation is very important, but particularly in radio, when, we will be able to look to America and look at, the sort of stuff that Howard Stern and some of those, really controversial presenters used to do. And you sort of think, well, yeah, I'm not sure that's better, I'm all for freedom of speech, but I'm not sure that we need some of that. So my relationship with regulators was fine. I think at the end of the day, I'm very pragmatic. You've got to play by the rules. And okay, I lobbied the lawmakers very hard over the ownership rules for radio because I wanted to buy more radio stations, and the rules were old-fashioned. So I spent a lot of time doing that. I've spent a lot of time at what was the Office of Fair Trading. I've been at monopolist people, trying to argue that the market was much bigger than just radio advertising. And they went, no, it isn't. Okay, yes, it is. And they go, well, prove it, which of course is very difficult. So, in terms of being substitutable, yeah, I think regulation is fine. You have to play by the rules, but it doesn't mean that the regulation is always right. And I think that the problem with regulation, as everyone says, is that, the world moves on and regulation catches up. So AI this week or last week, wherever it was, trying to work out how to regulate it. Good luck with that. But just on my sort of final point is that the thing about my book, which has proved to be quite popular, is the little bits I referred to at the end of each chapter, the action points. So I have got a plan to issue a sort of revised, much shorter version with just the action points. You don't have to read all the rest of it. You don't have to read the stories. You can just have a look at the Monday stuff. So that is theoretically coming out the first quarter of next year. So
absolutely brilliant. Well, while we're on the subject of the book, David, and I thoroughly recommend people go for the full fat version, because it's thoroughly, as full fat things often are, thoroughly enjoyable, and you get something. There's some protein and benefits of it as well. Remind people what the book is called.
The Monday Revolution, and you can buy it on Amazon and all those other places.
Fabulous. And if you go into the show notes, you will find links to that there, so it's easy for you to get hold of. And David, if people want to find out more about you, how can they get hold of you?
I'm on LinkedIn, or you can email me on davidjmansfield.com.
Amazing. Links to all of those things as ever in the show notes. David, firstly, thank you for writing a fantastic book. Actually, in fact, let's go back and say thank you for being a key part. I didn't know it at the time, but thank you for being a key part of my childhood, teenage years and growing up, because I used to spend a lot of time listening to the radio that you put together and entertain me and help me through that difficult phase of my life. So I want to say thank you for that. Thank you for writing an amazing book that I just really enjoyed it. And there's so many little bits. And the bit I really like, as you say, is the bit that you're digesting down to the practical steps. But thirdly, thank you for being a fabulous guest on the show.
Well, it's been great. It's been, it's just been very, very interesting. You're a great host. It's just been a nice, informal conversation, and I very much enjoyed it.
It's been a brilliant start to my Monday. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, Christian.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to David for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about David, the Monday Revolution, and links to some of the things that we talked about on the show, have a look in the show notes. You'll find those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, thanks for listening. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes that you've missed, visit the podcast website, humanriskpodcast.com. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, please do on whichever platform you listen to it on. It really, really does help. I'll be back with another episode of the show very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe. Try and bring some revolution to your Mondays, and thank you so much for listening.